Hello. So today we're going to be talking about Nikolay Gogol's The Government Inspector, which is one of the great masterpieces of Russian theater. So Gogol's a kind of interesting figure in Russian literature, and I'm not a Russian literature specialist by any stretch of the imagination, so this is my very sort of cursory summary of him. Gogol is a sort of interesting insider-outsider kind of figure because he's Ukrainian, so he's not actually Russian as such, which gives him a sort of unique outsider's perspective on a lot of the qualities and characteristics of Russian society, and yet he's at the center of this early 19th century Russian literary scene. So he's moving in the same circles as people like Pushkin, who is one of, if not the greatest Russian writer of all time. Gogol is in the same kind of circles that Pushkin is moving in. So he's definitely involved in this sort of renaissance of Russian literature in the early 19th century. So The Government Inspector is a comedy in 5 acts, which is a very sort of traditional, I'd say French type form. At this point, Russian literature was very heavily influenced by French literature, and in this case by French theater, because you have a very definite, in sort of golden age French drama from the 17th through the 19th century. You have a very definitive dramatic form, which is built around a 5-act structure. And so Gogol is using a similar approach here. This is a comedy. It's a satire, more specifically. It's a satire of the corruption and incompetence of Russian officials generally, sort of provincial small-town officials specifically, but the application ends up being much broader. So the story is about a young man, Ivan Alexandrovich Kleshtikov. I think Ivan Alexandrovich Kleshtikov. So Kleshtikov is a young man from St. Petersburg, a minor government official, on his way home to his family's estates, and he's ended up in this small town where he has run out of money because he dines extravagantly, he spends on clothes extravagantly, he gambles continually, so he's living well beyond his very modest means. So he's banged up at this inn, and he doesn't have any money to pay for food. He's been selling his, or rather he's been having his servant, Ossip, sell his clothes, and he's not sure how he's going to get out of the increasingly large bill he owes the landlord for staying in this room and for food. But at the same time, you've got the mayor and this set of various bureaucrats and people like this. So we've got the inspector of schools, we've got a judge, we've got the warden of charities, the postmaster, etc., etc. All of these people are on the take, in one way or another, usually multiple ways. And they get word that a government inspector is coming to check this town, and they assume that this government inspector is coming to attempt to root out corruption. when they learn from a couple of sort of Tweedledum and Tweedledee type landowners that there is an elegant young man from St. Petersburg staying at this inn and not paying for anything, they assume that Kleshtikov is this government official who's been sent to check up on them. Sorry. And so essentially they start simultaneously trying to cover up the evidence of their corruption and to buy Kleshtikov off. So, for instance, the mayor comes in to this inn where he's staying and he says, "Oh, don't worry about your bills. I'll pay for all of your bills. Bring him the best food. Why don't you come stay with me rather than this crappy hotel," etc., etc. Kleshtikov goes to stay with him, where he starts romancing Maria Antonova, who's the mayor's daughter, as well as, to a somewhat lesser extent, Anna Andreevna, which is the mayor's wife. The mayor is fine with both of those things because he's desperate to protect his own corruption. And, like, there's great scenes, great comic scenes here where for the majority of Act 4, for instance, there's just a parade of officials who come and visit Kleshtikov in his room and basically just give him large amounts of money, 200, 300, 400, 800 rubles at a time, under the guise of loans, which they're thinking of as, if I can bribe this official, then he won't turn me over for corruption. But this is one of the things that's really interesting to me about the play, is because Kleshtikov, it's not clear how much he gets what's going on there. So, at the beginning of Act 4, in Act 4, Scene 2, for instance, right before this parade of officials comes through to give him money, Kleshtikov says, and he's soliloquizing here, so we know from theatrical conventions that he's telling the truth, and he's not lying to someone else to try and fool them. Kleshtikov says, "Nothing can compare with fine hospitality, particularly when it's given from a genuine will to please and not from ulterior motives." So, as late as Act 4, he's thinking that these officials are just incredibly generous, and he hasn't started to really ask any questions about it. Though, by sort of the last third or so of Act 4, he is starting to realize, in part because it's pretty suspicious if you have a series of officials coming into your room and basically just being like, "Here's money." Like, at some point, even someone like Kleshtikov, who's not super bright, starts to put things together. And so, by Scene 8, he says, "This place is crawling with officials, but I have the feeling they've mistaken me for a man from the ministry." And then in the next scene, his servant Osip, who's figured this out scenes and scenes and scenes ago, at least an entire act before Kleshtikov realizes it, Osip says, "We'd better make tracks while the going's good. They've taken you for someone else, that's what." And so this to me is one of the really interesting things about Gogol's play, is that justice arises from this sort of cosmic accident. Like, these officials who are swindlers, who are corrupt, who are oppressing the serfs and the peasants and whatever it is, Kleshnikov never says, I'm going to teach them a lesson, or I'm going to take revenge on them for their misdeeds, or anything like this. Kleshnikov says, oh, they're going to give me a ton of money, well, I'm going to take a ton of money because I want money. So this is, I think, particularly sort of, we see this contrast particularly with Femi Osifison's play, Who's Afraid of Solarin, which is an adaptation of The Government Inspector, because his version of Kleshnikov has a couple of moments where he sort of says, these are the type of officials whose corruption is ruining Nigeria, or I'm going to make them vomit up all of the money that they've stolen from the peasants and the people of the country. So in Osifison's version, there is this sort of sense of justice, and I'm going to take revenge for the wrongs done. But in Gogol, we don't have that, which in some ways to me seems sort of very Russian of him, even though he's Ukrainian. But that idea that, like, the universe is sort of absurd and the universe punishes people not because human beings are necessarily good, but because the universe is twisted in that way. Like, things just happen, and sometimes people get their comeuppance. Which I think is a really fascinating sort of ethical component of this play. But the other thing that I want to talk about with The Government Inspector is the final scene, which is a really interesting scene. It's a tableau, but it's a really sort of bizarre tableau that apparently Gogol was really not happy with the way that it was staged any of the times that it was produced during his lifetime. But at the end of the play, spoiler alert, at the end of the play, Kleshnikov has taken the postmaster's fastest horses and carriage, and he has lit out for the territories with all of the cash that these officials have given him. The officials have realized this, in part because the postmaster, who reads everybody's letters, even though it's illegal, has read Kleshnikov's letter where he tells his friend in St. Petersburg about all of this stuff that's happening. So in the last scene, so they're enraged. The officials are enraged. So in the last scene, a gendarme comes on, and so that's a policeman, basically. And this gendarme announces, the official who has just arrived from St. Petersburg by imperial command requires your presence at the inn immediately. So the actual inspector has now shown up. And then the stage directions say, so basically the whole group suddenly changes position and stands as if turned to stone. And this is what the description of the mute scene says. The mayor stands in the middle like a pillar, arms outstretched and head thrown back. On his right are his wife and daughter straining to reach him. Behind him the postmaster, transformed into a question mark, stands facing the audience. Behind him is the inspector of schools in a state of innocent bewilderment. Behind him, right at the edge of the stage, are three ladies leaning against each other, directing the most sarcastic looks at the mayor's family. To the left of the mayor stands the warden of charities, his head slightly cocked to one side as if he were listening for something. Behind him is the judge, arms spread wide, squatting almost to the floor and puckering his lips as if about to whistle or mutter, now we're really in the cart. Behind him is Korobkin, winking toward the audience and directing contemptuous looks at the mayor. Behind him, right at the very edge of the stage, stand Babchinsky and Dobchinsky, arms outstretched toward each other, mouths gaping, eyes popping. The other guests are simply transformed into pillars. The petrified group maintains this position for about a minute and a half. So this is the idea of ending with a tableau is not necessarily that unusual in theater of the 18th and 19th centuries, but this is a really bizarrely vivid tableau. And I can see why this would be hard to stage, especially hard to stage in a way that would satisfy somebody like Gogol. But like, people being contorted into question marks and squatting on the floor looking like you're about to whistle, and all of these sort of weird, bizarre details that give you this sort of frozen scene from life of these characters' reaction to the knowledge that not only have they been cheated by Kleshnikov, but now the real government inspector is here, and they now have to deal with the consequences of their corruption. So it's a really fascinating play. Again, I think the satirical component, the way that Gogol treats corruption, is really, really interesting. Particularly, again, given that sort of sense that, like, this is not, the punishment that these officials experience is not about justice, it's about the universe is cruel and arbitrary and hilarious. Thanks for watching.